Welcome to the Global News Podcast from the BBC. Hello, I'm Oliver Conway. And today we're joined by our transport correspondent, Theo Leggett. And Theo, we're going to talk about the jet fuel problems caused by the US-Israeli war with Iran. How bad is everything at the moment?
Well, there are pressures building. I think that's what you'd say. The situation at the moment is that the price of jet fuel is very, very high and has been since the start of the conflict. It was at one point more than double what it was at the start of the conflict. It's come back off a little bit, but it's still very, very high. It's already causing some airlines to put up prices, and it's already causing some airlines to cancel flights. And there is talk, and at the moment it is just talk, about a physical shortage. If we continue, particularly in Europe, in the direction we're going in at the moment, that is no fuel supplies coming from the Gulf, where normally about half of Europe's imports come from, then stocks that are held in European countries start to dwindle, and eventually they dwindle to a level where there has to be some kind of prioritization going on, which means that, according to the head of the International Energy Agency, you could see, for example, some airports running out. But these would be localized shortages. Large airports like Heathrow probably wouldn't run out of fuel, or at least not initially, but airlines would at some point, if that continued, have to ration, and that would mean cutting back services.
Looking at cancellations, how many are we talking about as a proportion of all the flights we see every day? What kind of routes, and are certain countries more affected than others?
It depends on the airline, because an airline like Ryanair, for example, is very different from United or American Airlines or British Airways. You know, you've got long-haul carriers, you've got short-haul carriers. Each airline would look at its portfolio and look predominantly at where the profit is and where the consequences of cutting a flight are going to be greatest, also the fuel savings they might make, and they will undoubtedly prioritise the routes which have the highest density, which most people want to travel on, and they might choose to cut flights on routes where they have enough services that it might not make that much difference from a passenger's point of view. Now, the fact is that the high price of fuel is making some routes that might otherwise have been economically viable less profitable. So, for example, this week we've had Lufthansa cutting about 20,000 flights from its summer schedules. Part of that is the closure of part of its business, Lufthansa CityFly, but it's also the impact, quite clearly, of fuel prices going up. Other airlines, for example, United, has said ticket prices could go up 15 to 20%. So it's hard to put a precise figure on it, but it is happening, and happening to airlines around the world.
And is it having an impact on passengers as we speak?
Well, if their flights are cancelled, then yes, but they might not notice it too badly, because one thing that airlines will try and do is accommodate passengers who are already booked on other services. So, for example, if you have 4 or 5 services a day going from one city to another and you cancel one, you might have spare space on the other flights, so you might just move a passenger's booking. So we're not at the situation yet where lots and lots of passengers are being inconvenienced by all of this. What we are looking at is higher prices in seasons to come, potentially the summer season in Europe, for example, less availability of seats, ticket prices being pushed up anyway by the price of fuel, and therefore passengers having to pay more to get to where they want to go.
And just on the cancellations, if your flight is cancelled, do you get compensation?
Well, you would get a refund if you were unable to fly. The compensation point is a really interesting one, certainly in Europe, where there is a regulation called EU 261, which provides for passengers to be compensated if their flight is delayed or cancelled. And the compensation bill can run into hundreds of euros per passenger, depending on the circumstances. Now, airlines in Europe and in the UK have been lobbying Brussels, the British government, to set out specifically that flights cancelled due to increasing fuel prices or other consequences of the conflict in the Middle East would be considered an exceptional circumstance. And if they're considered an exceptional circumstance, then compensation is not paid out. So the airlines are already lobbying, even though they say at the moment there is no problem, there is no fuel shortage, they are lobbying to make sure that the law is tightened up so that if they do have to cancel flights, they don't have to pay compensation.
Now, we're also seeing the price of petrol at the pumps go up, gas as they call it, in the US. What is it specifically about jet fuel that's causing these specific problems?
There are two issues with jet fuel. One is that a very large part of what we use in Europe comes from the Gulf region and in particular Kuwait. Those supplies cannot get out at the moment. Now, Europe has been trying to find other supplies of jet fuel. So, for example, you can get jet fuel that's made by Dangote in Nigeria. There may be some extra coming from there. There's been a big effort to get more from the United States. But one of the problems here is that the United States uses a different type of jet fuel to Europe. So Jet A1 is certified for use in Europe, Jet A is certified for use in the United States. Why does that matter? Because US refineries are predominantly geared up to make Jet A. So although some increased supplies are coming across the Atlantic, it's not enough to make up the shortfall. And then you have the situation in East Asia as well. Now, East Asia does make a lot of its own jet fuel, but it relies on crude oil supplies predominantly from the Gulf in order to get the raw material that it makes that jet fuel from. So in other words, it's being hit as well by the crisis in the Gulf, and quite badly. So you have all of this coming together, and ultimately it ends up being a shortage of the refined product that is particularly serious. And that is why you have seen the price of kerosene, of jet fuel, go up far in excess of what's happened with the oil price. The oil price before the conflict was around $68 a barrel. It went up at its highest point to $119. It's now around $100. So it's been moving a lot. It has gone up a lot, but nothing like what we've seen with jet fuel. Jet fuel is a refined product. There are limited areas where it can be made. There are limited supplies, and that's the issue.
And in terms of airlines, is there anything they can do both in the short term and in perhaps the longer term to get round ththese issues?
Well, there are various little tactics they can use to improve their own fuel situation on a flight-by-flight basis. So there's something called tankering, where a aircraft can take off with more fuel than it needs from an airport which has plentiful fuel or cheap fuel or whatever, and then fly to its destination, and then it will have fuel on board to carry on to its next flight without having to top up as much.
Although it will be heavier, so it will presumably use more of it on that route.
That's the argument against it. It's environmentally not a good idea because you are ultimately burning more fuel because the aircraft is heavier. And this has been frowned upon in Europe. There are rules to minimise the amount of tankering that goes on. Airlines in Europe are lobbying the European Commission to temporarily suspend those rules so that they can do a bit of tankering if it helps ease them. Longer term, of course, investment in more efficient aircraft. It's a great idea, but the airlines are already doing that because aviation fuel makes up a large proportion of their costs, so they want to minimise it anyway. They're investing in efficient aircraft. The current generation of aircraft is much more efficient than the previous one, but order books are full. So it's not something you can do overnight. You certainly can't say, there's a crisis going on at the moment, I'll go out and buy some new planes, because those new planes won't be delivered for a number of years.
And if the Strait of Hormuz were to reopen tomorrow, how long would it take for things to get back to normal?
It depends who you talk to in the industry, but you have to remember that tankers from the Gulf to Europe, say to Rotterdam, take about 5 or 6 weeks normally, and those fuel supplies have to be brought in, have to be processed, and have to be distributed. So again, it wouldn't be overnight. Also, there are a lot of tankers currently in the Gulf that would have to make their way out. There would be something of a traffic jam in the Strait. It's not as though all of that shipping can just come straight out. It can't. What if the infrastructure, the refining infrastructure, has been damaged? There are some unknowns there. And it does take time as well, even if the refineries aren't damaged, to get them back up to speed. That's a process that can take a few weeks as well. So in other words, if you listen to Willie Walsh, the Director General of the International Air Transport Association, the after effects of this, even if we get fuel supplies coming through the Strait pretty quickly, are going to linger for months to come. And that means high prices in terms of jet fuel for months to come, and that does unfortunately mean higher prices for passengers. So even if you don't get your flight cancelled, your holiday plans may go ahead as you want, and if you've booked early, you may not even see a price increase this time round. Future tickets are going to be more expensive and for quite a long time to come.
Theo, thank you very much indeed. Theo Leggett there, our transport correspondent. If you'd like to hear more from the Global News Podcast, click on the link below. Thanks for watching.